Well, for more on Trump's trip abroad, I'm joined by Jeanne Zaino. She's a professor of politics at Iona College in New York. Jeanne, thank you so much for being with us. All right, first up, Trump's trip has now wrapped, his first overseas trip abroad. How would you grade the first foreign trip?
It's a particularly difficult time for him at home, as you know, and the trip itself, despite a few self-inflicted wounds, seemed to go pretty well. So we give him high marks here for the trip. It was a long trip. It was a tough trip. You compare it to President Obama and George W. Bush, who went to Canada and Mexico. He hit a number of countries, many parts of the world, and he had some tough negotiations. So I think all in all, it was a successful trip. And I would suspect he'd rather stay abroad than come home to the turmoil he faces here.
Give me the high points and the low points of the overseas trip. What would you say was the high? What would you rate the low?
I think the high point was really his visit to the Middle East. I think most of his stops there were very successful. And of course, the deal he struck in Saudi Arabia is one he's going to talk about an awfully long time. So that was very good for him. I would also say his visit with the Pope went really well, considering they had had words during his campaign. I would say the low point was probably the G7 and the NATO, because there are just so many policy issues that he differs with the leaders in Europe there. But we knew the European leg of the trip was going to be the toughest for him, and it was.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the body language, because that seemed to be, particularly when it comes to the U.S. media, something that makes a lot of headlines. You're not going to necessarily hear people give him all the credit for the speech in Saudi Arabia, but certainly, Melania Trump, the first lady, slapping his hand away, the brush up with foreign leaders, the shoving. Give me a little insight into that.
That has been a huge issue over here, and I'm certain abroad as well. I don't put as much stock into it as I think some people do. For those of us who are familiar with Donald Trump, this is very much in keeping with the Donald Trump we know he's something of an alpha male. And so, the shoving, those kinds of things, those are things we're used to. I think the surprise was the Melania Trump aspect of this. That was a little bit of a surprise. But, I'm one of those people who gives the First Lady a pass on this. This is a long trip for her. She didn't sign up to be First Lady. And, I'm not sure we should make as much of it as some people have.
Well, of course, married for 12 years and together for 17.
That's right.
But in that sense, how does Trump's overseas visit compare with past presidents? How would we kind of stack that up?
I think it went very well. Again, he chose a very tough first trip. And so I give him a lot of credit for that. I would say we see something of a role reversal when we compare him to Barack Obama, who, had a much easier time of it in Europe and is still probably more beloved in Europe than Donald Trump is, but who, of course, never issued the kind of tough talk about NATO, for instance, and who is very much in keeping with the European leadership on issues like climate change. So it's a very different environment, and he's coming over there as a very different president. And I think added to that is the idea that for many of us, and certainly European leaders, they don't know what to expect from this president, because when it comes to Donald Trump, it's always the unexpected. And that's true. And I think we saw that again on the trip, although he kept his tweeting to a minimum, which I think was a good thing.
Jeanne, we know that U.S. President Donald Trump is en route back to Washington right now. Tell us what he is heading home to, particularly with regard to the Russia allegations.
He is heading home to a very tough time. His closest advisor, his son-in-law, was just recently announced, as you heard, is under investigation, or at least a person of interest vis-a-vis this Russian collusion investigation. Jared Kushner is, of course, very, very close to the president. So that's certainly to be a blow to the president. We understand the president is lawyering up, hiring attorneys to handle this. He's going to set up a war room to deal with what has become an increasingly full-blown investigation over here. You not only have the FBI, you not only have the Justice Department, but you also have several congressional committees looking into this. So that's going to be hanging over his head. And let's not forget, This is a White House and a president that still has many positions to fill. They haven't even filled all the positions they need to fill. So they're not even running, at a 100% capacity. And in addition to the probes, they're also facing some really daunting legislative tasks: healthcare reform, tax reform, immigration, and of course the economy and jobs, where the president wants to focus most of his attention. So he's got a real uphill battle when he gets back here. And you have a Congress that will go into recess before we know it, and they'll go home and hear from constituents about what they're unhappy about when it comes to the Republicans. And that's going to strike a blow to the president as well.
Jeanne Zaino, thank you so much for that analysis on what has been a very, very colorful trip, the U.S. president's first overseas trip abroad.